So thank you very much, Nicola. That was a super panel. And we're hopefully going to follow by another super panel, the last panel of the day, entitled Voice Fraud is Evolving, Are We? So the fraudsters are growing smarter. There's no question about that. Is the industry keeping up? That's the question we're going to try to answer today. So with AI-driven attacks, difficult regulations, fragmented collaboration, the battle against fraud is far from won. But can we turn the tide? That's what we're going to try to hopefully answer today with our panel of super guru in the fraud prevention area in the industry. Please help me welcome Lee Turner, who is Head of Industry Engagement and Regulatory Affairs at Gamma. Catalin Badea is VP Product Management at NetNumber. Katia Gonzalez, Head of Public Policy at Proximus Global. And Sharon Brennan, Managing Project Support at Comreg. Everyone, welcome to the last panel of the day.
Thanks.
Are you with me? So thank you for taking time to join us today. It's going to be a short panel, 30 minutes. So we're going to have a lot to discuss in such a short period of time. So let's start with the beginning. I like to always start at the top and take stock of where we are at the moment with different challenges and opportunities. So voice fraud is evolving rapidly. We all know that. What do you think is the biggest threat today? And how have these threats changed in the last 5 years? So where are we at now? Where do we stand before we start looking forward? Katia? Sharon,
I was going to say, in voice, I suppose really the biggest threat today would be AI, because prior to this, voice was voice. You could recognize people's voices and you knew who was talking. But now, and we could make appropriate regulations to block down, fraudulent numbers and what have you, and misuse of numbers. But now we're entering a whole new league, I think, with AI, because now voice isn't to be trusted, the actual voice itself.
That's a very good point, Sharon. Who else wants to jump in? What are the biggest threats today in the fraud space? How has that evolved in the last 5 years? Lee?
I don't think it's so much evolved as that in other parts of the market, there's been a lack of evolution. I think what happens is the telecom market has changed significantly in the past 5-10 years, particularly in business comms. Business comms is way advanced as compared to a residential consumer market. What we found, though, is that because the regulatory life cycles are usually a 5-year life cycle between market reviews, they're sort of behind the curve in some countries. Some countries are better than others. There's a lack of consistency in regulation, which means having consistent platforms to fight fraud internationally. If you've got an international presence, it's a lot more difficult because you haven't got that consistency in legislation, sometimes regulation, and the application of it. For instance, we're seeing regulation coming into the UK, which is fighting inbound spoofing. But it's all based on the fact that a call is going to come in through a typical type of PSTN route. It doesn't look at IP voice, where calls are originating using IP addresses and coming in over the internet, in effect. So again, there's an evolutionary process, and the danger is that the fraudsters are always one step ahead. As Sharon said, they're looking at AI. We're still trying to tackle IP voice.
Yeah. Katia, are you with us now?
I hope so. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
My apologies for this issue. I'm really sorry for this.
Don't worry. So, Katia, what do you think are the biggest threats today when it comes to fraud and fraud prevention?
I think so. I agree with Lee. So the fraudsters just keep up with the evolution of our industry. As we evolve, they will follow up on that, because that creates also more opportunities for them. I've heard mention fraud in all of the discussions today, which is surprising. 6 years ago, we wouldn't have heard of it at all. And I think one of the biggest threats is that we keep on focusing only on what we know, on the voice fraud, be it spam or robocalls or even IRCF. on SMS, AIT, we have been talking about it. There's also robotexts, but we rarely talk yet on how fraud is impacting also all the cloud communications, how it's also may start impacting also the APIs. So again, and also something else is all this cross-sector impact of fraud. So we are starting to now hear how the telecoms vulnerability to some of the threats is impacting also the banking sector, but also other sectors. And we need to start having, in my view, a broader look at fraud. Not, we keep on trying to solve issues from, okay, let's install a platform here, let's pull a regulation in this country, let's put something else here. It's a global issue. The communications are also global, but we keep on trying to address a global issue in a global ecosystem from a very individual perspective, from an enterprise or from a national regulatory position. And I think that's where we need to grow and take a wider look at it and try to, it's not going to be easy, but I think that's where we need to be a little bit thinking out of the box.
Okay. Catalin, anything to add to that, or?
Yeah, so I would say, AI in particular and technology in general, it's much easier today for fraudsters to collect, subscriber data, victim data, and automate their fraud methods. And on the other hand, everything is mobile first, so they get access to, the victim's devices by installing some sort of malware. Then it's much easier than it was, 5 or 10 years ago to essentially, take over all of the accounts and defraud the victims.
Okay, and we've touched a bit on regulation. Do you think regulation is moving up fast enough to keep up with the fraud tactics? Is it truly making an impact so far, Sharon? I guess you're a regulator.
Yeah. Well, I think that regulation is making an impact. Certainly in Ireland, the interventions that have been rolled out, you could see the level of blocked calls jumping up when the interventions became mandatory last October, some of them. But we're not moving fast enough, because that's the issue. The fraudsters, as we said earlier, it's organised crime, it's state-sponsored. They're all working together. They're collaborating away, and they don't need legislation. They don't need anything. So they're very agile. They're moving fast, and we're kind of then lumbering behind, trying to block up, as Katia said, what we know. As opposed to looking at what's coming. So no. Not fast enough.
But the problem we're struggling to deal with what we know. How can we deal with what's coming? I don't know what the solution is with that.
I would say more collaboration between banking have been feeling the pain for a long time because they pay out, and they have a lot of very good systems, but as they point out, they only catch it at the end when the money is actually leaving somebody's account, whereas the fraud has been ongoing or being set up sometimes for many months before that, with the pig butchering, as they call it. So it needs to be a much more collaborative approach between banking, telcos, the media, Facebook, Google, everything. And only by doing something like that and setting up a kind of like a little ecosystem on our side will we have any hope.
So we've heard from the regulator about regulations. Who else wants to jump in about regulation? Lee?
Yeah, I don't mind. I mean, I would say that in the UK, we're pushed a lot to self-regulate. The message we hear is try and get your houses in order, otherwise we're going to have to do something about it. But I never thought I'd say this, but in order to self-regulate effectively, you need a strong regulatory framework and legislative framework underneath it. Because if you make it quite loose, then you're going to get different interpretations. We already see that in the EU, where we've got one regulatory framework, but each member state implements things in a different way, going from quite extreme in some cases to very loose regulation. It's difficult. I'll give you an example. In the UK, we're being pushed, particularly on numbering, on how we monitor things like non-dialable CLIs, all that stuff. We don't have a national numbering database in the UK. We need and there's no regulation to build one. There's no support to build one. The regulators are a little bit worried about pushing industry into what could be an expensive solution. But in some cases, we need that bit of a stick and a support. And the reason why we need the regulation is the people who are on these calls and the people who are at all of the industry meetings and the various collaboration meetings, there are people who want to fix it. But there's a lot of people who don't attend this. And that's where you need the regulatory and legislative framework is to push those people in the right direction.
Yeah.
Katia, do you agree? Do we need more regulations?
So just one point I was going to make, Lee, is that now that I am a regulator, I understand that the regulatory people in operators, like, they don't get huge budget because it's non-money making. So they need regulations in order to be able to get budget to put systems in place.
But it's also legislation, because the regulator can only regulate what's in the Communications Act. So, for instance, in the UK, we carved out number-independent interpersonal communication systems at the Communications Act. So the regulator cannot now regulate over-the-top messaging apps, which we are increasingly seeing being used for fraud. So as you saw with Apple's reaction, as soon as you said we want to do something, they threatened to pull the services out. So again, it's that consistency. When you ask someone to self-regulate, it's like having no speed limits on the motorway and no speed cameras, but saying we all have to drive at a certain speed.
I think regulation has an important role in establishing kind of the absolute minimum is not the ceiling, but is the absolute minimum that's reasonable for everyone in that given country to implement. I mean, the example that I would give here is the in the US, the entire regulations around robocalling and robot texting, where the FCC came out and said, you have to implement DNO, do not originate. And you have to block invalid, unallocated, unused numbers, because if there is a call coming, with such CLIs or a text message with such sender IDs, then there is a high likelihood that that's illegitimate traffic. So you can do much more than that, but that's kind of the absolute minimum that everybody should do to keep the ecosystem safe.
Katia, you wanted to say?
Yeah, because we keep on talking about these very specific in-country regulations, and what is missing is some kind of harmonization between these regulations. For example, there's a new regulation in Australia, quite recent, that has put a number of quite stringent requirements when it comes to avoiding scam traffic. So monitoring the traffic on voice, on SMS, absolutely on everything. So monitoring the traffic with detail, blocking the traffic that is fraud, sharing information about the fraud events. And these requirements for international players, especially in Europe, are very hard to meet, because that means that we need to monitor with a level of detail, looking into metadata, into even, that depending on the frauds, you need to really look in detail into the messages, sharing information, the numbers that are used, the URLs, etc., etc. So these requirements are very hard to meet for European companies. And even in other countries, I know Europe is not the only one that has privacy concerns around it. So we need to find a proper, harmonized minimum set of rules that make sense. And I do agree, we don't need to over-regulate. It doesn't make sense. It takes a lot of time. It makes things complicated. And then even the evolution may be complicated, but we need to have this minimum set of mindful rules that allow for interpretation, for proper interpretation, so that it can be used and stretched a little bit. RCS, who's talking about RCS for right now? Very few people. So,
so I think one of the things we've said so far is, the effort is very fragmented between the operators, the vendors, the regulators. It's a global effort, so it makes it even more difficult. How can we make collaboration more effective? Because I know we've been talking about collaboration for quite a few years now. How do we turn it around and make it work? What's the way to do that? Maybe Katia, what do you think?
I don't know if it was Lee or Catalin who said, okay, I think it was Lee. Of course, collaborating, we have different industry groups. We get together around here at MEF and other groups, but it's always the same people who get around the table.
Yeah.
We still miss out some of these players that don't think it's important enough. Somebody else will do it for them. Have rather short-term views on how to make money on this business. That will interpret so freely the regulations that, well, one would question whether there's anything really behind that interpretation. So I think we need to, as an industry, so first of all, we need these minimum regulations, because that is the only way of setting a minimum standard. We know there are many others that will not constrain themselves in any kind of self-regulation. And we need to, all of us who are around the table in these groups, have a more ethical view and sustainable view on how to do business. We can decide who we do business with also. And maybe that's not something that we take sufficiently seriously. It's a hard one because the business model of this industry is done in such a way that it can be open to many abuses.
Okay. Catalin, anything to add? Okay, Lee, sorry, go ahead.
I would say, I mean, the one thing that we're pretty bad at, we all talk about data sharing, but we talk about it in silos at different groups and never share the information on data sharing. You know, we talk a lot about trying to share data, but when you look at the wider thing, I think one of the threats we have is now, certainly within the UK, the financial institutions are now talking about how compensation is shared with telco providers. They're mandated to pay compensation. They're saying, just a minute, the only people making money out of this are telco providers. They're charging for calls, they're charging for minutes. We're having to pay compensation. And because of that, it's starting to drive conversations now, collaborative conversations with the finance institutions. But it has to be wider. We're talking to domain registrars. You know, these guys have to register a domain. They have to open a bank account. And when we talk about data sharing, it's all around, as telcos, how do we share data? But there's wider data sharing initiatives. Is we can share data back with the banks. These guys do have a bank account. We have details of the perpetrators. Let's lock down the money. You know, so there are many different avenues of data sharing. But what I do find, and the concern is that the vendors of solutions are now starting to get quite a loud voice within the discussions, because I think somebody put it, there's blood in the water and the sharks are now circling. They can see that there's commercial incentives to push industry down certain routes with certain commercial solutions. I think industry's got to take matters into its own hands and drive what they require and not be pushed as to what people can sell us. And there's a danger that if we don't collaborate successfully, and we're not just talking about as a telco industry, but as a wider ecosystem of people affected by fraud or within that platform, we will end up having to eat someone else's dog food that we don't particularly have an appetite for.
It's a good expression.
Great metaphors, Lee.
That's a good expression. So I guess, what about AI? I mean, I know I mean, I didn't want to talk about it today at all, but it's the end of the day, so I'm going to talk about it. We've touched on it a little bit at the beginning of the session. You know, in some way, AI is a great tool for the telcos to fight fraud, but it's an even better tool for the fraudster to fraud even better. So maybe it would be better without AI at all. But what do you think? Do you think we can use AI effectively to fight fraud? Instead of us being reactive and more proactive, maybe it's a way for us to be more proactive? What do you think? Lee, what do you think?
I think we can, but the one thing we've always got to remember is that fraudsters are not bound by law or legislation or any restrictions. And what we're starting to see, again, coming back to Katia's point, AI has been interpreted in different parts of the world from a legislative perspective in different ways. In the UK, there's next to no discussions on AI apart from us being the hub of AI. That's it. Whereas in the EU, there's discussions about how effective and use of AI is governed. In other countries, it differs. Again, we need that consistency, because otherwise, what we do is with inconsistent regulation on things like AI, we open up avenues for the fraudsters to use the easiest route to market without any consistency. So we may find a strong legislation on AI in one country, but not in another. They'll use that other country's infrastructure to deliver those services. I do think from an AI perspective, because one thing that I think we have as an industry is we're always acting reactively. Everything we do is the frauds. Somebody's attempting to commit fraud, or somebody's committed fraud or a scam, and rather trying to trace them, track them, block them, stop them doing it again. I think AI is the definite tool that we can start to look at to build the information up front and try and introduce those proactive measures.
Dynamic.
Do you all
Yeah.
agree?
And
What do you
that-
think?
Yeah, I was just going to say dynamic would be a word. Like, all the interventions we're putting in at the moment are very static, but what we really need are dynamic AI interventions that are, spotting things and shutting it down straight away.
Yeah.
But a critical element there is data privacy. Data privacy regulations. So we have been talking about getting the industry together, sharing information, getting the whole ecosystem to talk. The problem is that often we cannot talk. We cannot share the right information because, once again, all these data. So and it also impacts network APIs that I've heard a lot about network APIs today in the different sessions. AI is a little bit the same. So we lack proper harmonized understanding of what can be done in the light of fraud protection. So many of the data privacy laws are quite old and were built in a time where we didn't have the issues we have today, that the industry didn't have the same dynamics. So we need to move on and we need to adapt. Because otherwise,
is it a
we're
losing
just
battle?
creating
Because I'm
breaks.
hearing we need more regulation, but then sometimes we have too much regulation. It's stopping us from being more flexible than the fraudster. It's I'm not sure where is there a way for us to turn the tide at all.
It's the time to implement. So what happens typically with regulation is there's a consultation, there's a statement, that takes 6 months. We then argue for another 6 months to a year about how we're going to implement it and how much it's going to cost us. 2 years down the line, we're implementing systems that are trying to prevent something that was happening 2 years ago. The fraudsters have moved on. And so we go through that iterative process of another 2-year cycle to try and block the next one. And that's where AI can play its part, as Sharon said. Can we use these tools to become these iterative tools that, instead of having to start from scratch every time with the whole cycle of consultation, statement, implementation, we can use AI for that more dynamic purpose.
Okay. So I guess we're coming sadly to the end. I mean, we have another 5 minutes. If you could tell people one thing they should focus on or prioritize to battle fraud, the fight against fraud and voice, more particularly in this panel, what would it be? Katia, do you want to? What would be the thing you would say to people to prioritize?
Prioritize a sustainable business. I won't even talk about fraud anymore. I think it's deciding how we want to construct our business for it to be sustainable and stop thinking short term.
Okay. Lee?
No, I agree with Katia. We've got to get away from a business of seeing fraud and driving developments in fraud prevention because it's a risk to our business. It's seen as it's going to affect our reputation or our profitability. We fight it from the wrong side of that. We should be seen to be doing the right thing as an industry rather than the right thing from a protecting our shareholders, can we put it? and protecting the reputation of the business. But again, the other thing as well is to influence our regulators. I mean, there's a worrying thing coming out of the FCC last week. They sent out a notice on March the 12th called Delete, Delete, Delete. And they're looking at how they can reduce regulation. It's a new order from the government in how to deregulate. You know, how do we fight those sort of things and get that consistency?
Okay, worrying. Catalin?
Yeah, I would say more and better fraud data sharing, kind of to a point that Lee made earlier, not in silos, but, you know, across the entire industry and in between industries. You know, this needs to be facilitated obviously by you know, tools and processes that preserve, you know, data privacy, anonymity, and doesn't, you know, pose a danger to competitive advantages that one or the other, you know, carriers or service providers might have. But, you know, in terms of data sharing, there's a lot that, you know, we talk a lot about it, but it's still not done to the level that I think would be necessary to make it effective.
Okay, and Sharon, maybe to close us down?
Yeah, I suppose I would agree. I'd be thinking collaboration between not just the telco industry, but the banks and the hyperscalers and, you know, anyone who's affected by this, like government bodies are often, you know, they launch something like a tax back scheme and instantly they're hopping on that. So yeah, data sharing. And actually, Katia, I kind of always thought GDPR was set in stone, but something you said there, I was thinking, why maybe it should be revisited, because it was put in place at a different time. And GDPR and our data sharing regulations are definitely having an effect on how we're able to collaborate within our own industry and with, you know, the other industries affected.
There you go. Okay, that's an interesting concept. Well, on this note, thank you so much. I think it's super interesting. We could have talked for much longer, but maybe we should do that again soon. Thank you very much for taking part, everyone.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
And for